Hi, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the debate in Harrisburg in the state capitol still centers on the education budget. The president of PSEA, that would be the Pennsylvania State Education Association, will join me for a discussion of the state's education budget, and then a legislative update with Capitolwire's Pete DeCoursey. Pennsylvania politics and government, in depth and in detail. And guess what? It all starts right now.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Well, joining me is Jim Testerman. He's sitting across from me. He's the president of the Pennsylvania State Education Association, hereafter PSEA, so you all know. We've tried to present a whole variety of viewpoints on this program over the last couple of months. People that like the governor's cuts, $1.2 billion in cuts to the basic education budget. Jim Testerman is here to chat about that. Jim, welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, it's not going to come as a big surprise to anybody that you all aren't exactly wild about the $1.2 billion. Talk about what you think the effects, if the legislature were to do that, and we can get into whether you think they will, to have on the education, on elementary, secondary, pre-K, the whole bit. Go ahead.
Well, $1.2 billion worth of cuts means that things like full-day kindergarten, which we know makes a huge difference in students being ready for first grade, larger class sizes will come into play in the fall, tutoring programs, things we know work for kids are going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, now, on the other dimension of that is that this would be, by my recollection, probably the most substantial cuts to the education budget, both your budgets, you know, in the schools, and then, of course, the higher ed that we've seen in, I don't remember a time in 30 or 40 years. And is your argument would be that these just aren't at the margins, you know, that everybody has to share maybe a 5% cut? But my calculation is close to 15%. Is that about, am I right or wrong about that?
It depends what school district it is.
And talk about that. That's a good point.
I live in New York City, so I just did a presentation there, so the numbers are pretty fresh. The average cut per student in New York City is about $508. That is 10 times as much as the wealthiest district in York County. How is that fair? In the places where students are going to schools in struggling communities, the resources that are needed to help those students be successful are going to be disproportionately cut from our urban centers, and that I just think is unforgivable.
And correct me if I'm wrong, even though the poor districts get more from the state on the formula, the wealth of those districts is substantially less than suburban and other school districts, so in the end, you take it from there.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the tax system in Pennsylvania has poor districts having to tax their lower income earners at a higher rate. So they actually have to tax harder, and that actually ends up having a dramatic impact on property taxes in those places and people who can least afford to pay those taxes. So they end up not generating as much local revenue to educate kids as a wealthy district outside of the city.
Yeah. So I want to move on to a couple other aspects of the governor's proposal. We had the Secretary of Ed, Charles Ogby, on, not Secretary of the Budget, rather, who gave his position on it. So we're trying to be, present a variety of views on this subject. So we're happy that you're here to do that. Do you think, even with the program that now, or the policy that would now allow school districts to hike property taxes with those 10 exemptions, that that's adequate, or do you think that the legislature is simply just going to have to provide you all with more money, that it just can't be done based on increasing property taxes?
They're not going to be able to do it just by increasing property taxes. The fact is the state has an obligation to provide an appropriate public education for all of our students. Backing away from that commitment by $1.2 billion is not going to serve our students well. And let's be really, really clear. Pennsylvania has made great strides in student achievement. No state has higher 8th grade reading scores. Only 6 states have higher 4th grade reading scores. Only 7 states have higher 8th grade math scores, and only 4 states have higher 4th grade math scores. We've been doing a lot of great things in Pennsylvania, and that progress, I think, is going to stop with these cuts.
All right, we're going to run to a break. I want to ask you about a very controversial proposal dealing with school vouchers. Before I do that, if you had a bet right now, the $1.2 billion in cuts, it's more than a bet because you pay a lot of attention to this. Legislature is going to reduce that. would you say?
I think they're going to be moving around some of the budget numbers. The legislature has a vested interest in making sure that these cuts are not as severe in their school districts. But if the governor sticks to his $27.3 billion spend number, all we're going to be doing is robbing from Peter to pay Paul.
So
we really need
some other
revenues.
programs elsewhere in the state, but you think that the 1.2 in the end will be modified by the legislature. What the exact numbers you're not?
I think so. That, and especially higher ed with that 50% cut, it just can't stand.
Yeah, on that I concur. All right. We'll be back. I want to talk about vouchers. Very, very controversial. We'll get into the subject of should the Pennsylvania legislature provide folks with, give them a sum of money, let them go to a private or a public school of their choice. We'll talk about vouchers in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania Cyber Charter School, bringing educational innovation and freedom to the children of Pennsylvania. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by ReconnectPA.org, supporting a comprehensive transportation funding solution, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Hi, welcome back to the program with Jim Testerman, the president of PSEA. We're going to talk about school vouchers now, and all we believe in disclosure here, full disclosure. I've done, as you all know, I do polls. I've done polls for PSEA on this subject and other organizations representing the management, so it's just not labor, it's business and labor on a lot of these education subjects, as you well know, right, sir?
Yes, I do.
Okay, let's talk about vouchers. As you know, 2 state senators have introduced into the Pennsylvania Senate a program that would provide vouchers for low-income kids. They would allow them, in families in poor-performing schools, to take those vouchers to go to private and public schools, leave the school district. In other words, take a sum of money. There's all sorts of amendments going on and considerations in the state Senate. And I know your organization is not in favor of it, to put it mildly. Exactly. Why are you opposed to it?
The reality is that parents don't get to choose the schools. The private schools get to choose who they're going to allow in or not. There's no transparency on how, or accountability on how the money is spent. And the reality is the school choice program, which 86% of the public does not support, and especially once they know more about it and the increased costs for transportation, the reality is it does nothing to turn around those struggling schools. And it's time that we all get honest and roll up our sleeves and talk about solutions for those priority schools in which students are growing up in poverty, and they bring some of those issues with them into the classroom. How do we address that as a community, as parents, as educators? This bill does nothing to do that, and we need to focus on that in Pennsylvania.
Well, what about then one of the difficulties that the legislation has is that there have been some efforts to broaden it to include ultimately virtually everyone in any school district, in any income level, who would be able to use vouchers. As you know, that's been a source of controversy. Governor Corbett has expressed some concern about the narrow focus of the current proposal, which would only apply to kids in relatively low-income families in poor-performing districts. Does that provide any additional enticement for you?
It doesn't, and actually, here's the disconnect for me. They're cutting $1.2 billion from public education. So the system that they are in charge of making sure works well, they're going to cut $1.2 billion, and now they're going to start a new bureaucracy with a voucher program that is separate from the public school system, which they're charged with adequately funding, and they're not.
Now, one of the concerns that I think Republican lawmakers have, particularly in rural school districts, number one, they don't have wouldn't be a lot of options for the kids who live in rural schools who go to public schools to avail themselves of, an accessible, let's say, private institution. Are you hearing the same thing, that some of the problems that exist are just that lawmakers themselves, their constituents, might not be able to utilize the program? Is that a serious problem, do you think?
Well, each legislator votes for or against something for a variety of reasons. And I think when you get in the middle of the state in the T, where there are no private schools that they can access, they say, okay, why are we going to cut $1.2 billion, and especially from some of their school districts or their institutions of higher ed, why are we going to cut all that money and then send this money to parochial schools or private schools?
Now, we're going to run to a break, but before we do, there's a key question. The likelihood of passage, this was tried in 1995 during the Ridge years. It did not pass the legislature. The proposal now is certainly a bit different. What's the prospect for passage? Is it, you know, it has the Senate and then the House to go? It's not out of either chamber yet. What's your sense?
There's no legislation in the House yet, so I think that's encouraging.
Correct.
I think the reality is that it's stumbling in the Senate because the more people find out about it, the more they struggle with supporting it. And I think the reality is in the Ridge years, we actually had money. We were in a dot-com boom back then, so they could actually come up with the money for it. There's no money with the deficits that we're facing in this Pennsylvania to fund this new program to hand over public money to private institutions with no accountability.
All right, I'm talking with Jim Testerman from PSEA. We're going to get into some alternative ways that are, you know, could be possible to fund a budget, which the governor has rejected. We'll talk about some of those after we pay some bills.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the State System of Higher Education. 14 state-owned universities. The state system is the largest provider of higher education in Pennsylvania. And by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to the program. We're talking about the governor's budget proposal on education. As I think everybody knows, with Jim, everybody knows about it who follows this program, our audience. Jim Testerman's the president of PSEA and a teacher in Central York School District. Jim, let's talk, I mean, over the course of the years, there's been lots of suggestions about how to deal with recessions. Typically, in a recession, we've raised the state income tax. We've had 4 of them since 1977. That is, recessions, we've raised the state income tax. Would you and your organization think that there are, I mean, is it your argument that rather than do these cuts, is it necessary to raise some taxes that ought to be done?
Yeah,
even though that may not be the most popular thing to propose.
Personal income tax is probably the easiest because if you earn more, you pay more in income tax. But there's things that the legislature has not considered that they really need to consider. You've talked a little bit about it. The Marcellus Shale, we're the only state in the country that's not taxing the extraction of that natural resource from our soil. $200 million this year, $400 million and plus in the years after that. Smokeless tobacco, cigars.
And then don't tax smokeless cigars.
The fact that you know, large corporations get to keep 1% of the sales tax just for processing and sending it in. That's all computerized now. So that 1% should come back to the state, as well as the fact that closing the Delaware loopholes for companies that set up shop in Delaware so they don't have to pay their fair share of taxes here in Pennsylvania. So I think there are a lot of ways to go at this without going after the working families in Pennsylvania. If it's about shared pain, and our members are sharing some of the pain, as the governor requested, we need to look at making sure that everybody is contributing in a fair and consistent manner.
Do you have a position, or is it something that you just let to the legislature? I mean, now, many of your school districts have proposed, no pay hike for this year. That's it, no pay hike. We'll forego it. Is it concern you that there ought to be more shared sacrifice? You know, particularly in the legislature and other places. I mean, is this something that if some folks are going to take no pay hike and pay a little more in benefits, that ought to be shared more equally?
Well, it definitely should be shared more equally. And I think it's important to note that I said our members should consider the pay freeze or other cost-saving measures. In some places, they are taking furlough days. In some places, they're paying more for health care. In some places, they're just coming off of a pay freeze. Yeah. So all of that, you know, kind of has to be worked out locally.
Each school district by school district.
Yeah, they have to work that out locally as far as what's best for them. And you know, some of our members get frustrated because at the same time they're talking about a pay freeze, they're talking about AstroTurf or investments in things that maybe are seen as extras right now, or hiring a different administrative staff.
Things that if we had a different fiscal environment you might consider, but not at the moment. Is Is that your point?
Exactly. So when our folks go to the negotiations table on this issue, they want to see what the plan is. Show us at the district level how everybody is contributing to making sure that we keep programs in front of kids and we keep class sizes at a level where we can do good things for kids.
All right, thanks for coming in. All right, Pete DeCoursey is here, Capitolwire. Guess what? The legislature, we're going to talk about the legislature or maybe the governor on this program. No way. We'll be back.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Well, joining me, as often is the case, is Pete DeCoursey. He's the Bureau Chief of Capitolwire. All right, Peter, you heard this discussion I just had with Jim Testerman, and, you know, the voucher thing is a little more complicated. I mean, this has a history that goes back to '95. This voucher program that's now in the state Senate, the genesis is different than what we've historically seen as vouchers. Talk a little bit about that.
If you look at who has been fighting for vouchers in the past, it's generally white Catholic legislators who think that the Catholic schools are the way out for kids in bad, underperforming city school districts. That's the sort of caricature, but it's basically accurate up until this past year. And the Ridge programs were essentially small voucher amounts, $1,000, $2,000.
In 1995 when they introduced the legislation, in 99, yes.
Yep. Now we're talking about big dollars. We're talking about $7,000, $8,000. We're talking about all the state funding that follows a kid to that district. And again, since they're among the worst performing schools in the state, they get more. You're talking about schools that get $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 a kid. Now, the voucher in this new program, Senate Bill 1, will be limited to what the tuition is, not to what the state share is for each child. But that's a big sum. That's a sum with which you can send your children to Catholic school and many other private schools, although obviously not to...
So now the point you're making is the shift is now towards low-performing schools, any student, low-income student in a poor-performing school, as opposed to sort of the motivation by sort of Catholic, urban and suburban legislators who had a different focus with their voucher program. Is that basically what you're saying?
That's exactly right. Now, last year, the voucher movement, knowing that Tom Corbett was coming, believing anyway that Tom Corbett was going to be elected, started casting around for what was going to be the voucher bill. And most people thought it would be something similar to the past.
Right.
And again, just to give you an idea how different it was, in 1995 or 9, I forget which, the income limit was $35,000.
You mean eligibility? If you had
if you had to be making less than $35,000 in your family.
Right.
Now it's 28, and that's 12 years later. So think of how much more targeted this is at the poor than that was.
Right.
I mean, it's almost half the income limit if you talk about constant dollars.
Is that what's prompted this big fight where folks now want to expand it into the middle class and eventually anyone who's eligible can get a voucher, or anyone in the state can get a voucher if they want it, regardless of income and the school? Is that where this is all heading?
That's the hope. I mean, I don't know about regardless of income. I think it'll always be capped at some income.
Okay.
But I mean, that is clearly the goal of Senator Piccola. He's made no bones about that. That's clearly the goal of the Reach Foundation. That's clearly the goal of Students First, the very lucrative pro-voucher PAC that started up last year with money from 3 investors out in Philadelphia, the Susquehanna Investment Group. And that's clearly the goal of Governor Corbett, is to have a wider program. But the problem, if you talk to people who actually have tried voucher fights before, they don't think there is an expansion. If you look at Milwaukee, if you look at other places that have had a pilot program, they pretty much still have what they started out with. These don't expand, they don't generally grow. So that there's this real fight in the voucher community over, if we get this, will we ever get beyond it to a middle-class voucher? And many people believe not.
All right. What's your sense that about its passage? As you know, no voucher plan has been successful. Difficulty getting it out of the Senate. Most people think the state house will be a tougher road to hoe than the state senate. You cover this pretty carefully. Passing, is this going to pass? I mean, does this really have huge hurdles in front of it?
I think it does. I mean, right now you have a Senate that is willing to pass its bill. You have a governor who will give them changes but hasn't given them yet.
Right.
But anytime when you have a tough bill like this, people want to do it in one vote.
Right.
They don't want to come back and have to vote 2 or 3 times and have 2 or 3 voucher votes on their record.
Okay.
So that the problem is, as long as the governor has not yet given you his changes, and as long as the House hasn't made any commitment at all,
right,
the
and
Senate,
no bill in the House,
the Senate, while it probably, if the Senate thought that Corbett would sign its bill and the House would take up its bill, I think the Senate could probably get 26 votes to pass its bill.
Right.
The problem is, once we see what the governor's changes are, how will that affect Senate support? Once we see what the House wants.
All right.
And the other problem, to quote Chris Bravicos, who's a longtime veteran of this, he represents the Reach Foundation, and he was one of the legislative architects of the Ridge battles. But you talk to Chris, he says, it's like the Goldilocks. He called it the Goldilocks problem. Some voucher bills are too hot. Some voucher bills are too cold.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to get Goldilocks, i.e. the House and the Senate, to eat.
Let's switch topics a bit. Governor Corbett has been opposed to a Marcellus shale tax, even though it polls quite well. Other considerations are that he has put together a commission to take a look at a whole range of state conditions surrounding Marcellus shale. Won't get into the details of it, but here's the point. He has opened the door a bit, despite no taxes, to an impact fee if it in fact gets recommended by the commission, meaning an impact fee for local communities, which they could use to help, for the infrastructure and other problems that get created by moving, by the drilling and other aspects of Marcellus shale production. What other considerations do you think are important besides the tax? And what has the administration been doing even before the commission gets it put into, it's operating till it produces its report? Is there going to be anything left?
Yeah, I think there's going to be major issues left, but I think you have to give the administration a little bit of credit, but also a little bit, you have to cast a wry eye on them, because as the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette pointed out in a very good story, you have this situation where the Corbett administration, to any legislative idea or any public idea, says, we'll have to wait till the commission does on that. But on the other hand, you have Michael Kranzer, the acting secretary of DEP, saying that he's going to review every permit. You just have you just had them take 15 water treatment plants that have been certified by the previous pretty environmentally active John Hanger and say those are no good.
You get the final word. Sorry I have to interrupt you. We're out of time. Thanks for watching Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.